Hello everybody, it's Math Dominus, and today we're going to be talking about DC, the company that's created some of the most famous superheroes, and I've made videos on them several times. Whether it's to praise some of the DCEU movies, because I'm probably one of the few people that doesn't really hate the DCEU, or because I'm criticizing the DCEU, meaning that I'm both a fan and a hater. Well, that's not really accurate. You see, I'm a fan of the DCU, and I get critical because I love it, because I want to see it improve. That's why I made a video criticizing the management and the bad decisions that the studio has made. And I can go on every day talking about the poor decisions and all of the creative choices that were poorly executed. But everyone's already made a ton of videos talking about the DCU and its flaws, so I just be beating a dead horse at this point. Everybody knows Suicide Squad is bad. Everybody knows The Rock tried to change the hierarchy of power in the DC universe, and The Flash was... well, I already made a video on that as well, even before the movie came out. So instead of making the 1 millionth DCEU criticism video, how about we do something a little bit different? Criticize the current DC film universe that's going on right now. After the DC Extended Universe ended, there's a brand new rebooted film universe called the DCU. And as much as I'm a fan of the DC Extended Universe, I can admit the DC Extended Universe had so many poor decisions and creative choices that it had a bad reputation that desperately needed a fresh start. And that's exactly what the DCU is, headed by James Gunn, who directed the Suicide Squad and is now placed in charge of the entire DC universe. Well, that escalated quickly. So we got the first few installments into the DCU, technically a couple, it's a little complicated. Yeah, there's a lot of issues with the DCU that I feel like a lot of people are just either ignoring or aren't willing to criticize. And I get the feeling that the reason people aren't being as critical with the DCU as they were with the DC Extended Universe is because, well, aside from the fact that it just started, it's a Force Awakens effect. When Star Wars The Force Awakens came out, I remember everybody was praising the movie and isn't as disliked as the sequel trilogy's reputation is now. In fact, I remember when I was still in middle school and everybody was hyped for the movie. It was probably one of the most hyped movies in recent history, to the point if there was any sort of criticisms, people would just dismiss them because, hey, at least it wasn't the prequels. So I feel like something similar is going on here. The DC universe is a breath of fresh air. People wanted something a little bit more positive, a little bit more higher quality than the DCU, and that's why people kind of have this rose-tinted view of the DCU. So in today's DC video, I am going to criticize the DCU because there are several issues and mistakes that I feel like are worth addressing. I should preface this video by saying that I'm not some hater for the DCU. In fact, as I said earlier, the reason why I'm criticizing it is because I care enough to point out its flaws to see it improve. If I can criticize the DC Extended Universe while still loving it, I can criticize the DC Universe while still loving a lot of things about it. So I'm not some Snyder bro who's just going to blindly hate everything. This is an honest critique about the DC Universe and its issues that it has. So without further ado, let's get started. The first problem with the DCU happened before it even started. The reason why the DCEU needed to be rebooted was because of its poor reputation, a lot of creative choices, and bad quality, so a reboot would basically wipe the slate clean. It's a chance to have a fresh start with characters like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, re-establish who they are, give them character development without having to worry about continuity issues with the previous universe. But you see, even though the DC Extended Universe had a bunch of failures, there were still a lot of things that people liked about it, and Warner Brothers could just not get rid of all of it. They have to bring stuff in from the previous universe into this new one. And apparently the actors had a lot of discussions on whether or not they would return or reprise their roles in this new DC universe, and... well, one of them was including The Flash. Yeah, they were gonna bring back Ezra Miller for the DC universe if it weren't for the fact that he's a bit cuckoo. And the Flash bombing at the box office. In the end, the only things that managed to stay into the DCU from the DC Extended Universe was anything that was related to James Gunn. But even then, that still kind of causes a lot of continuity problems, and completely misses the point of the DCU being a reboot of the DC Extended Universe. And I know some comic book nerd is gonna say it, but the same thing happens in the comics, where they reboot a DC universe, but they still keep some things from the previous continuity. Listen, just because it's based off the comics doesn't mean it has to adapt everything one-to-one. In fact, not everything should be adapted. TV Tropes calls this pragmatic adaptation, where some things simply just don't translate well when you're adapting into a different medium, so you just have to work a way around it. So just because it was in the comics doesn't mean it's good. Instead of being something that's completely brand new and fresh that doesn't have to worry about previous continuity, it now has to worry about some stuff that was established in the DC Extended Universe. And sure, not everything. Obviously, it's only the James Gunn stuff that is still somewhat canon, but there are still some issues. The first official installment in the DCU is Creature Commandos, and already there's an issue. It's a sequel to the Suicide Squad and references events that are in the Suicide Squad. Now, you could argue that the Suicide Squad is a standalone movie enough that you can really probably picture it as the first installment in the DCU and not have to worry too much about continuity issues. But as the series goes on, along with Peacemaker Season 2, there's already some issues arising. Creature Commandos heavily relies on the events that were established in the Suicide Squad for its plot points, its world building, and if you haven't seen the Suicide Squad, you're going to be confused as to what's going on in Creature Commandos in terms of world building, since there's a lot of plot points such as Rick Flag Jr. dying and the Suicide Squad being dismantled because of the events of Peacemaker, which is also a direct sequel to the Suicide Squad, which has a ton of references to the DC Extended Universe. If you go in watching Creature Commandos without having seen any of the other previous DCEU installments, then a lot of the plot points in the show are going to be confusing. And if you have seen the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker Season 1, then you are going to get a lot of the references in Creature Commandos, and it's a better show. But then that would mean that some stuff from the DC Extended Universe is canon, and now you have to figure out what exactly is canon and what isn't, even though this is supposed to be the first installment. And that just creates a whole lot of continuity issues that they did not think this through. You shouldn't have to do homework with what is essentially the first installment of a reboot. And even if you decide to ignore the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker Season 1 and decide that you don't care about the world building of Creature Commandos, that creates another issue. You're just not going to care as much if you had watched the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker Season 1. Because a lot of the world building and the big moments of this show are firmly established in the DC Extended Universe, but because there's no DC Extended Universe and this is supposed to be completely brand new, what's even the point? Why should we care about Rick Flag Sr.'s son dying if we never even got to know the guy in the first place? The show expects you to already have cared for Rick Flag Jr. in the Suicide Squad, but if you don't watch the Suicide Squad, then there's really no point in caring about him, and caring about his dad who's grieving the loss of his son. And yeah, you could say on a basic human instinct, you could say, yeah, but I still care about this guy who clearly lost his son, and yeah, you had fair point. If you have basic human empathy, you're still going to care at least a little bit, but will it hit as hard as if you already knew Rick Flag Jr.? Probably not, and therein lies the issue. Creature Commandos is a show that heavily expects you to already be familiar with the DCEU continuity, but because this is supposed to be the first installment of a reboot, and theoretically you're not supposed to care about the previous continuity, a lot of these plot points and world-building moments simply just don't hit as hard, and in fact could just be seen as pointless filler, because instead of focusing on developing the characters, we have to take a moment to explore what happened in the previous DCEU, even though you're not supposed to care about the DCU anymore. It can be said the same for Peacemaker Season 2. You don't need to watch the first season of Peacemaker to understand the continuity of Peacemaker Season 2. In fact, the first episode just has an entire segment dedicated to retconning everything and recapping everybody. OG James Gunn, I didn't know you have the same writing techniques as the writers for Transformers The Last Knight, who tell us that Optimus Prime has always been on Earth and didn't just first arrive in the first movie. People defend this lazy writing by saying that Season 2 just fixes all the continuity issues by saying that Season 1 did happen, it's just events played out differently. First of all, if you had just rebooted the DCU into something completely brand new, you wouldn't have to worry about fans complaining about continuity issues. And second of all, it's not that simple. Some events are different, but some events heavily rely on continuity that was established in the DC Extended Universe, and you can't just simply say, oh, something's happened differently, because now you have to wonder how they happened differently and how did this universe end up continuing the way it did, when some form of events from the DC Extended Universe had to have happened. A big example for this is in the episode where Rick Flag Jr. is established. He mentions that he was in a relationship with June Moon, aka the Enchantress, which heavily implies that some form of the events of Suicide Squad had to happen. So that means you have to add Suicide Squad to the timeline, and if you watch Suicide Squad, well, the biggest thing that happened in the movie is Superman dies.
I am dead. Not a big surprise.
even though Superman hadn't been introduced at this time. He was only introduced 3 years ago. But in Suicide Squad, he's already dead. He was already introduced because of the events of Batman vs Superman. So did some form of Batman vs Superman happen? Because if some form of the events of Batman vs Superman happened, then who was the superhero that died that ended up inspiring Amanda Waller and persuading the government to creating Task Force X in the first place? It can't be Superman, because Superman wasn't even introduced at that time, so it had to be some other hero. But if this hero was so important that it inspired the government to create Task Force X, then why isn't this superhero mentioned at all? It doesn't need to be mentioned in Superman or even have a big major role. They can just mention, oh yeah, this superhero died a long time ago and he was a huge inspiration. Because, you know, in Suicide Squad, when Superman died, that was kind of a huge deal, so you would think that maybe there would be some type of memorial or something to establish this. And again, I'm not saying that they need to focus on it entirely, just have something in passing and mention. But the fact that we don't get anything at all kind of shows the writers didn't really think this world building all the way through. Because they were thinking about only having certain events happen, but not all of them, even if it causes continuity problems when you don't have the whole picture. A lot of the events that happen in Peacemaker Season 1 and the Suicide Squad heavily rely on stuff that was already in the DC Extended Universe, but because none of that happened, we're just supposed to not care about it, but that ends up causing continuity issues and world building and lore issues. So logically, you would have to skip the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker Season 1 and just head straight into what is officially canon in the DC Universe. But if you do that, a lot of the world building in Creature Commandos and Peacemaker Season 2 just don't hit as hard. In fact, Peacemaker Season 2 heavily relies on knowing what happened in Peacemaker Season 1. And if you think about it, if you already did watch Peacemaker Season 1 and you do watch Season 2, yeah, a lot of the plot points and world building are going to make a lot of sense, but these aren't the same characters as Season 1. These are completely different versions of the characters. They just had similar events. So why should I care about these versions of the characters when I've grown to love the first versions from the first season? Do they even have the same character development? You see, these are the type of issues that wouldn't happen if James Gunn had simply just rebooted the DC universe instead of just, oh, I have to bring in the stuff that I already established into my universe. He didn't really think about how this would affect the continuity or how this would affect the events. How did events play differently? And if events did play differently, what events that heavily relied on the DC Extended Universe would have to be different in order to make the events of this universe make sense? There's just a lot of issues when you just don't reboot and instead try to bring a lot of stuff from previous continuity into this new one. And that's the first major problem with the DC universe. Now, I know a lot of people probably don't care too much about the continuity. I mean, hey, I'm a Transformers fan, alright? The continuity is all over the place. And hey, you know, the X-Men movies always had bad continuity. I'm also a Godzilla fan, and you do not want to get into the continuity of that franchise. So, yeah, I guess some people just don't care about continuity. Maybe this is not as big of an issue. It is rather sad that the average consumer doesn't really care about the quality and continuity of a franchise and instead just kind of consume whatever is in it, but that's the reality we live in, so we may as well just move along. Let's say you don't give a crap about the continuity issues and you just take everything in the DC universe at face value and that's all you care about. Alright. That doesn't mean that there aren't any issues. I'm gonna go by each installment of the DC universe and point out its errors. Starting with Creature Commandos, despite the world building heavily relying on the DC Extended Universe continuity, there are some other issues. My first issue is already in the first episode. Within the first 2 seconds, already we have... what? The first episode immediately starts with parroting the Manosphere incel type of groups. They call themselves the Sons of Themyscira. In the comics, the Sons of Themyscira are, well, as the name implies, the sons of the Amazonians that have been abandoned because the Amazonians believe that the males would corrupt their society. So I guess Amazonians are a little sexist. So these males were given to Hephaestus, Hephaestus, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, I don't know how to say a lot of these Greek names, the god of the forge. Now don't feel too bad, under Hephaestus' care, the boys were raised well, taught craftsmanship, and grew into strong, kind-hearted men, and they forged magical weapons for the gods, including Amazonian gear. So it's not like they were treated bad, but the fact that their mothers abandoned them still hits hard for them, and even Wonder Woman was very disgusted by the culture of Amazonians after that. It's an interesting piece of world building for the Wonder Woman mythos, and does give a morally gray background to Themyscira. It's all interesting, but what does James Gunn do with it? Well, use it as an opportunity to make fun of manosphere incel culture, the same thing that the She-Hulk writers did with Intelligentsia. In the comics, Intelligentsia was this interesting group of villains that wanted to take down the Hulk, and instead they're being used to do social commentary. Okay, listen, I don't like to bring up politics all that much, but like, there are these pieces of interesting lore and concepts, but you instead decide to use them as commentary for social politics. You just end up creating wasted potential and interesting story plot points, all for the sake of writing people you don't like into the bad guys of your shows. And look, I'm not trying to defend the whole incel manosphere thing, but let's be honest, if the political spectrum was reversed and it was a bunch of feminists being made fun of, how much are you willing to bet the show was going to be as well received? Think about it. Double standards. It doesn't matter whether you lean left or right, any type of social political commentary that isn't really necessary to the story is annoying, especially when there's a clear bias and you try to make your own politics look good, but if the politics were reversed, then it wouldn't be seen as good, even if both sides are wrong. There, I said it. I think both the left and right can be toxic and have bad politics. Can I go home now? Yeah, I don't know, I probably already pissed someone off already. The point is, referencing the manosphere incel culture was just not really necessary, and it took me out of the story, because it reminded me of the real world culture war and gender war, which, honestly, if I wanted to watch a movie or show that revolved around that, I would, but I don't want to. I just wanted to watch a show about monsters. So we're not even 2 seconds into the DC universe, and already we've alienated half of the fan base, who probably don't even want to care or be reminded of the culture war and just want to watch something to escape reality. And the worst part is, if James Gunn really wanted to do social commentary and use the concept of the Sons of Themyscira, there's already a social commentary right there. But then again, that is the social commentary of pointing out that sexism against men does exist, and that's rather uncomfortable for a lot of left-winged people in Hollywood. So, yeah, I guess that wasn't ever going to happen anytime soon. Also, now that I think about it, the fact that Cersei was actually trying to prevent the world from ending reframes her as the good guy, and since the Sons of Themyscira were her minions, they would also technically be in the right in helping her out, so they're technically the good guys. What did James Gunn mean by this? So, enough about the first 2 seconds of Creature Commandos. How does the rest of the show add up? Well, it's your average run-of-the-mill Monster Mash team-up show where monsters like Creature from the Black Lagoon and Frankenstein, etc. team up to become superheroes instead of being the monster society treats them as. Just adding the stuff from Task Force X into it as well, such as implanting bombs should they go out of line. For the most part, the show does a good job establishing who their characters are, what their names are, their personality, and their backstories. So you do get to grow and care about these characters, but the problem is a lot of these backstories happen in flashbacks that are happening in the middle of the story. If you remove the flashbacks, the story is rather streamlined. It's about these monsters that are supposed to be protecting the world from an evil dictatorship, and you know, this sounds kind of generic now that I think about it. Not much really goes on in Creature Commandos other than a superhero team stops an evil dictatorship, and I guess they learn lessons along the way. Now, if you take away the monster concept, that's basically what it is, so why did the characters need it to be monsters? Well, in-universe, it's because Task Force X was officially disbanded because it was inhumane, so Amanda Waller had to rely on subjects who weren't human to continue her program. Alright, so there's an in-universe explanation, but why did they need to be monsters for this specific type of plot? If you're going to do a Monster Mash type of story, why not have the monsters fight something supernatural, like a 1,000-year-old mummy, Dracula, or anything that's cool like that, but instead these monsters fight an evil princess. Yeah, an evil princess that doesn't even do that much until we find out she's evil towards the end. Now, to be fair, the first villain in this show is Cersei, so she's a witch, right? But then she kind of gets taken out halfway through, so she's not even the main villain. And instead of replacing her with something else that's supernatural, we just get a white woman. Oh, wait. White woman who is Hitler? It just kind of makes the monster concept more of a gimmick than actually trying to tell something interesting with the Creature Commandos. And if you read the Creature Commando comics, there's a lot that you can do. I mean, these are monsters. The original Creature Commandos in the comics were part of Project M, a US government experiment during World War II. The goal? To create super soldiers based on classic movie monsters to fight zombies, undead Nazis, and supernatural threats. Their members were a rotating roster. Each generation had its own different team members, but usually it had classic monsters like vampires, werewolves, a Frankenstein-like creature, and even had a Gorgon at one point, inspired by Medusa. These original stories were pulp sci-fi and surprisingly had a lot of emotional weight to it. And the villains they fought were usually reanimated soldiers, werewolf units, vampires, Soviet Union officers, Nazi-created zombies. There's a lot of things that the original Creature Commandos did that were in the tone of these monster fighting other evil monsters. Think of it as DC's version of the BPRD from Hellboy. So there's a lot that you can do with the concept of the Creature Commandos, but James Gunn just kinda wasted and instead just makes them fight these generic Iron Men, which any other superhero could have done. In fact, why wasn't this a sequel to the Suicide Squad? This could have been a Suicide Squad show taking down a dictatorship. You really don't need the concept of monsters from a storytelling perspective. The show really is style over substance. This could have been any superhero show, but because they added monsters, it adds something. So the monster stuff is really just a gimmick to get you to watch the show, rather than a show being about monsters fighting other monsters, and actually utilizing the concept of Creature Commandos to tell its story. So the concept for this story is wasted potential, and the writing is only really saved by its characters. You got Nina, she's a really adorable character. You got Dr. Phosphorus, who has a character development of being less of a dick. And of course, there's Weasel, probably one of the best characters in the show because of his tragic backstory. Either him or G.I. Robot, just because G.I. Robot is such a funny guy. The character who has the most development and a clear arc is the Bride of Frankenstein, or simply the Bride. She was basically created to be the bride of the Frankenstein monster, who's called Eric in this show, but then she... oh shit, this is actually problematic. You see, the bride's backstory is that she was created to be the wife of the Frankenstein's monster, but when she first woke up, she basically had the mind of an infant who didn't really understand what was going on in the world, so she was terrified. So she was taught by Victor Frankenstein. You know, kind of like how a child is being taught by their parent the basic things, you know, how to say your ABCs, learning about stuff in the world. And then Victor Frankenstein slowly starts to fall in love with the bride, and then they...
Now, Jeffy, tell the nice police officer exactly what happened.
Yeah, tell me. Daddy raped me.
Now, to be fair, James Gunn didn't intend to portray the relationship between Victor and the bride as something positive. He did say that it was not meant to be seen in a good light, that Victor is still a bad person, since he essentially groomed the bride. The problem is, this isn't really conveyed all that well, because in her backstory, we don't really see how she was affected by Victor grooming her, whether she was traumatized or even shown that she was confused by, you know. There's nothing that indicates that what Victor did to her had any sort of consequences to how she's portrayed in the present, and if anything, she kind of seems like she's still in love with Victor even after all these years. No resentment, no looking back that what he did to her was wrong. The show does a really poor job calling out that what Victor did was wrong, so James Gunn kind of unintentionally endorses grooming. And this is already a sensitive topic, so the fact that this was poorly executed just comes across as tasteless. Again, I know James Gunn didn't intend for this, but he just did such a poor job about it that it's just a gross oversight. So, yeah, I guess even if you ignore the unfortunate implications here, the show itself isn't that bad. The characters do kind of save the show. If you care about them enough, then yeah, the show is pretty great, but if you take away all that, and you take away the fact that this is a show meant to be about monsters, then you realize that the story is pretty hollow and is wasted potential. So your enjoyment of the show might vary. I also should probably warn you guys that the show is very fast paced. Things move way too quickly in the show. Since there's only like 8 episodes, they have to move things a lot quickly. So a lot of the character development feels a little bit rushed, but if you can handle that, then go ahead, I guess you could give this show a watch, but just so you know, it's not the kind of monster show that you would expect a monster show to have. And you might need to give yourself a barf bag because of the grooming stuff. And now that I think about it, Victor Frankenstein is also a necrophiliac because Okay, let's move on.
Holy fuck. I'm coming close.
So now we move on to the first installment of the DC Universe, the actual first chapter of Gods and Monsters, and the first movie, Superman. Okay, so for the most part, Superman is actually a decent made movie. Is it perfect? Well, not really. There are still some writing issues, such as James Gunn's old style of humor, where the humor seems to take away from the serious moment. For example, when Superman was giving a really great speech, and then Krypto comes along and just starts beating the crap out of Lex Luthor. I'm surprised he isn't dead. It's a funny moment, but it takes away from the seriousness of Superman's speech. And a lot of moments where the suspension of disbelief is really put to the test. I can believe that a man can fly and lift buildings and that he has a dog that also has a similar power set. I can believe all that, and even a supervillain that is really smart to build advanced technology and is able to clone, alright? I can believe all of that. My suspension of disbelief isn't broken. But you mean to tell me that Lex Luthor was able to memorize all of Superman's power moves and is able to predict his every move no matter how fast Superman is able to go? There's also some glaring plot holes, like Metamorpho saying that he can't physically hold his son while he is flying because obviously he is transforming into air, but then he transforms his arms into tendrils to get Superman out of the black hole. All while he is flying, so can he or can he not carry his son? The only reason this was added was just to give a little bit of an action sequence during the black hole scene. Then there's also the part with Hawkgirl where she basically commits a war crime and kills the chancellor of a country and you know, it's kind of funny how people don't see this as problematic, even though in Man of Steel, people gave crap when Superman snapped Zod's neck when he was about to destroy the entire planet. But I guess this is okay because real world politics. Okay, again with the social commentary, can we not? So no matter how you spin this, Hawkgirl is essentially committing a war crime, and I really doubt that there's going to be any sort of consequences to this. I mean, he essentially killed the president of a US ally. Does she get reprimanded? Does she get kicked out of the Justice Gang? Or, well, we really don't get anything like that, because again, nobody cares about the world building in this universe. Say what you want about Zack Snyder's Batman vs Superman and Justice League, but at the very least, no matter how clunky it is, they do care about how the world reacts to things and actually have some sort of logic in them, even if, debatably, the logic is rather inconsistent. So maybe the DC Extended Universe is a bad example. So let's turn to their competitor, Marvel. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Avengers saved the day, but they caused a lot of destruction, and it was later addressed in Captain America Civil War, where they introduced the Sokovia Accords so that the superheroes can be registered under government supervision instead of being vigilantes that take matters into their own hands and cause even more destruction. See, that's the type of world building that I like, where they actually address some of the issues that superheroes might face in the real world. And I get that the DC Universe isn't trying to be the real world, but earlier in the movie, Lois Lane was calling out Superman for interfering with the war. It was treated with a lot of nuance, and I actually do like this scene because Lois Lane was bringing up some really good points against Superman interfering in a war. Yeah, Superman is kind and he wanted to stop a war, but then he kinda did it without any oversight, and yeah, it's a really good scene. So if they were able to address this in the movie, are they ever going to address the fact that Hawkgirl committed a war crime? Probably not. Actually, in Hawkgirl's case, it's probably even worse because at least Superman isn't associated or represents America. Meanwhile, Hawkgirl works for the Justice Gang. That's funded by an American company. So essentially, an American company committed a Black Ops mission. There should be some consequences, but I'm willing to bet nobody's going to care about this because let's just focus on the cool superhero stuff, yeah. Who cares what the United States or United Nations have to say about this? Apparently DC fans, when they care when Superman killed Zod, even though he had no choice in that one. So as you can see, the writing for Superman can be very clunky, and there's a lot of issues with it. But again, despite everything that I said, for the most part, the movie is pretty fine. Superman himself is a well-rounded character who has an interesting arc of learning to separate his alien heritage and to grow to love his human heritage where he really learned his values. He's flawed, he's relatable, and I love him. David Cornsweet does a really good Superman. You can really get that Christopher Reeve aura from him. A kind and gentle older brother that anybody would love to have. I also love Lois Lane in this movie. Not because I have a crush on her, well, I guess I do have a little bit of a crush on her, but she is a rather intelligent character who questions Superman's actions and has a really nice falling in love arc, which we don't really get to see that often in movies nowadays anymore. She's also part of the reason she was able to figure out Lex Luthor's plan, so she's not just some damsel in distress, but she actually plays an active role in the story, especially when going to rescue Superman with Mr. Terrific. Oh yeah, Mr. Terrific is the MVP of this movie. Like, he's just a really smart guy with just this Giga Chad aura. He doesn't take crap from anybody. He helps push the plot forward, he helps rescue Superman, he's the only one in the Justice Gang that actually does anything. He's basically the best character in the entire movie. As for Nicholas Holt's Lex Luthor, well, I'm kind of mixed on him. On one hand, he definitely channels the energy of Lex Luthor, this evil businessman who just wants to conquer and really hates Superman. But on the other hand, he feels rather underdeveloped. You don't really get an explanation for why he hates Superman until like the very end in this very clunky exposition. It's kind of similar to the one in Batman vs Superman, where Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor basically tells Superman his backstory towards the end, but at the very least with that version of Lex Luthor, he wasn't trying to be the regular Lex Luthor we know from the comics. It was meant to be a parody of, like, you know, tech bros and Facebook moms, I guess. Whereas Nicholas Holt's Lex Luthor is clearly supposed to be an inspiration from the comic books, and while he does a lot of villainous stuff, so did the Jesse Eisenberg Lex Luthor, and you know, I'm just comparing these two because I know there's a lot of similarities, and I have no idea why the Nicholas Holt one is the more loved one, even if they're really similar in a lot of ways. I genuinely don't know. Is it just because he has no hair? It's probably that. So overall, Superman 2025 isn't a perfect movie, but is a serviceable Superman movie that does have a positive message. It has good characters, it's lighthearted, hopeful, not cynical, and the story is very simple and gives Superman a well-defined arc that's really satisfying and relatable. All of these qualities are a massive improvement over Creature Commandos, especially since Superman actually does stand alone. Yeah, Rick Flag Sr. shows up in this, but he doesn't bring up the events of Creature Commandos, so Superman really should have been the first chapter of this newly rebooted DCU instead of Creature Commandos. But it is what it is. Superman, decent movie, flawed but decent. And simple. So now we get on to the next installment of the DCU, which is season 2 of a show where the first season isn't canon. Oh boy, we're off to a good start. Peacemaker Season 2 is a direct follow-up to Season 1. Or actually it isn't, because Season 1 didn't happen. Or wait, it did happen because some events are canon and some aren't, and yeah. Okay, so let's just ignore the confusing continuity issues and just focus on what Season 2 is trying to tell. It takes place after Season 1, where Chris Smith is officially trying to be a superhero, but the world hates him, so then he travels the multiverse to go to another dimension where he is loved, but oh no, the other dimension is Nazis! So he has to learn to make do with the world he lives in right now. It's a rather simple story, and for being a multiverse story, it is, well, pretty basic. The first part of this story is rather decent, and establishes the character arc for Chris Smith, aka the Peacemaker, where he has to learn that as flawed as his world is, that is the world he is meant to live in. It's a really neat arc, and John Cena gives a heartbreaking performance. Honestly, this is the best acting he's done. It's certainly better than Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson in Black Adam. And the side characters are really funny and help support the main character, especially Eagly, where he just gets an absolute power-up and kills Yondu again. And the relationship between Chris and Hardcore was really dramatic and interesting. It's basically two broken people just learning to fall in love and to learn to be vulnerable with each other. It's the type of love story that me as a hopeless romantic just absolutely adores. They eventually both learn to love each other, and Peacemaker eventually comes to terms with the fact that yes, he's done a lot of bad, but he's also done a lot of good, and he shouldn't give up on life just because he is traumatized from the bad stuff. So for the most part, Season 2 was actually well written and is a pretty great story and a natural continuation from the first season, even if it's not canon anymore. Keyword: the first part of Peacemaker Season 2 is great. It's the ending that kinda boils down the entire season for me. It felt like Chris could have had all of his character development immediately, or maybe even during his time in Earth X. Maybe after his father died and his brother almost died, or maybe immediately after that, or maybe after the jail scene. They could have had that scene where the characters tell him that he should love himself because he's done more good than bad. But we have to go through all of these portal shenanigans with Rick Flag Sr. and the government, clearly trying to set up the next Justice League arc for this universe. It's very clunky, and it almost feels like that one scene in Batman vs Superman where they introduced the Justice League through entire email videos. But at least that was just one scene. Meanwhile, we get an entire episode dedicated to them exploring different worlds, and it's all building up for the Justice League Salvation run, which, may I remind people, was not a very good run that was well received. And even if they are going to do it, you kinda need to establish some supervillains for your DC universe, because that's kinda what the Salvation run was about, where the villains all teamed up and take over this entire dimension. Yeah, they basically wasted our time with a bunch of filler that was meant to set up the next arc that people from the comics didn't even like. If they were going to tease what the first Justice League movie is going to be about, they could have just made this a post-credit scene where Peacemaker's portal was taken to some government facility, and then some government people are looking over it and wondering what potential uses it could have been. That would have been way better, and they would have gotten the character development sooner rather than later. Instead, we get a bunch of traveling portal dimension scenes that really don't amount to the story and is just there to set up the Justice League arc. And then Peacemaker gets teleported into the other dimension. Oh no, how is he going to escape? Well, considering that season 3 isn't being made anytime soon, this was just teasing for the sake of teasing. It's just, none of this needed to be there, and it kind of ruined the show for me. Like, we could have had something really interesting going on, and maybe Peacemaker gets to go on more adventures for season 3, but instead, all this, But again, for the most part, season 2 was alright. It had a serviceable story. It really was just the final episode that kind of ruined the season for me. But for the most part, it is decent and a major improvement over Creature Commandos. But it's not as good as Superman. So yeah, that was my honest critique on the DC universe. This universe is heavily flawed and it has a lot of issues so far, but despite everything that I said, I look forward to watching future installments because, like I said, I don't hate the DC universe. In fact, I love it. That's why I'm criticizing it, so it can improve. Even James Gunn himself said that he is looking forward to listening to criticism so that he can improve his movies for the future. And that's something that's really important that I feel like a lot of fans are missing out. It feels like people are giving James Gunn a pass just because the DC universe is very different from the DC Extended Universe, where instead of being dark and gritty, it's jolly and hopeful. But just because it has a different tone doesn't mean it's exempt from criticism. You still should criticize the things you love, because if you want to see it improve and do better and become something so iconic and memorable that could last for generations, well then, you gotta tell it to do better. But it's kinda hard to do it nowadays because it feels like Gunn fans and DCU fans hate criticism because they think that if you criticize the DC universe that you're some kind of Snyder bro, or you think the DCU is better so therefore your opinion is invalid, which, first of all, you can like both. You can like the DC Extended Universe and the DC Universe at the same time. I mean, heck, the DC Universe takes stuff from the DC Extended Universe. And second of all, criticizing the DC Universe doesn't automatically make someone a Snyder bro. In fact, a lot of people that don't like the DC Extended Universe also criticize the DC Universe, including Critical Drinker, Mauler, or all these critics that get called right-wing grifters, but surprisingly, they were not called grifters when they were criticizing the DC Extended Universe for some reason. Interesting. I understand that Snyder fans have been acting toxic, but again, that's a vocal minority that you shouldn't focus on, and at the same time, Gunn fans have been acting toxic because they refuse to handle criticism against their DC universe because they feel like it's an attack by the Snyder bros, when really, I'm just a DC fan who cares. So if there is a way to end off this video, I say good luck on James Gunn's DC universe. I hope to see it improve and maybe become something truly special. I look forward to future projects that they have in store, and James Gunn fans, please learn to handle criticism. Not everybody who has issues with the DC universe is a Snyder bro attacking the thing you love. Sometimes they just genuinely don't like something, and criticizing it will be able to help improve it. There's a difference between a vocal minority that attacks something and the average Joe who's just criticizing something that they care about. A vocal minority attacks something they hate, but ultimately it leaves no big impact, so there's no reason to pay attention and make a bunch of videos on it. Whereas true fans and average Joes do make a big impact on how well these movies do, and if they voice their concerns, they should be allowed to express their concerns, because criticism comes from a place of love, and maybe love is the new punk rock.